Hello, I'm Damian Harris, and I'm Accenture's global lead for service engineering. And I'm joined today by my colleague Nick, who's also an expert in this field. Today, we want to talk about how do you bring some of the modern engineering practices to the discipline of service management, and really try and make service management much more relevant and modern in the way that it's operating with other parts of the organization. As the industry sort of grapples with best practices and who's got the best ideas, it's sometimes easy to lose track of a broader underlying theme. And that broader underlying theme is that your customers don't care about whether you subscribe to agile or DevSecOps or ITIL or any other management methodology. What they really care about is great products and services that solve meaningful problems for them. And we view ourselves as being a pluralist, which is we don't really care where good ideas came from, but we're really passionate about the good ideas in the pursuit of great products and services. So whilst there are some brilliant ideas in Agile and Lean and DevSecOps and SRE, there's also some brilliant ideas in ITIL 4. And really the art of service engineering is how do you bring those ideas in a way that's relevant to the particular products and services that you're building and running, and making sure that it is the pursuit of greatness in products and services and not slavishly saying that you're aligned to ITIL or DevSecOps or any other management methodology. Now, interestingly, when you think about the industry and terminology that's used in the industry, here's a Google view of word countage usage. It's interesting to see that whilst product management is a term which is used more and more these days, actually service management as a term is still much more the dominant factor. And that's more a point of interest than fact. It's just to say that this idea of service management has existed for a long time. It still remains relevant. And sometimes when we hear people having these slightly theoretical debates about what's a product and what's a service, and ultimately they are really referring to the same thing in many cases. And in fact, if you look at a typical service portfolio, we would have a number of distinct business units, which are at the top of this slide. We've got at the bottom of the slide, we've got all the things that technologists care about, whether it's infrastructure or applications or processes. But in the middle, it's the service portfolio that glues those two things together. So whether you're talking about a mobile banking service or whether you're talking about a payroll service, these are the things that really create value. And if some people want to call them services and other people want to call them products, I think that's a relatively moot point. The really important point is you want payroll to be paying people with the right amount of money in the right accounts on the right days. And that's what's really important about it. Now, if you had to think about how you would chart the performance of any service, there are a few competing elements to it. If you invest too much time in trying to reduce the cost to serve, for example, then over time, maybe your reliability needs may not be met. If you focus too much on speed to market or speed to value, then you may have to absorb some risks in some of the activities that you're doing. And increasingly, things like the experience of the customer or the user or the employee, however you want to phrase it, using that service, and also the carbon footprint associated to that service are interesting and important dimensions which try and give a much more balanced view of how you chart the progress of any given service. And if you start to think about how do you apply that across a portfolio of services, you can see that whether you're talking about anti-money laundering or whether you're talking about the Imperial Credits Exchange service, it doesn't really matter. The point is that each service is going to have its own unique needs, and it may have its own requirements to try and find this balance across what we call 360-degree service value. Now, in particular, and this sort of resonates very much with the SRE thinking, is that if you accept that reliability is probably the most important feature of any system, meaning if the system's not reliable, it doesn't really matter what the functions are to a certain extent, customers will get very frustrated with it. So if you start to think about reliability and the importance of, the performance of the service through that lens, we have been pushing an idea that we call critical service outcomes. And actually, that idea comes from our contribution to to ITIL service strategy over a decade ago. And the principle was a service is a means of creating value for customers by facilitating the outcomes they want to achieve without them having to own specific costs and risks. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but if you break it down, it really means that each service really needs to understand who are your customers, what do they need to be successful, what are the critical service outcomes that they need in order to facilitate the things that are really important to them, and what costs and risks do we as a service provider own on their behalf. And as you can see in this example, in an ideal world, you might want to, for each and every service, you might want to define your critical service outcomes, but that's often somewhat overwhelming. If you've got a portfolio of 250 services, that's a very difficult task. But if you were to focus mainly on your top 20, top 50, top 100 critical service outcomes, and there's no reason why you can't scale those over time. So in true agile thinking, start somewhere, learn through doing, scale fast. You can get to a position where it's much easier to have sensible conversations about how IT is really powering the business units through the delivery of these critical service outcomes. And increasingly, whilst the rear view mirror dashboard has been something which, probably everyone's familiar with, moving to more of a real-time service reliability app where at the click of a button, you're able to see your portfolio of services, you're able to see which services are performing well. Those that aren't performing well, you can click through and see which of the critical service outcomes aren't performing so well. When you understand which critical service outcomes not performing well, you can then start to see, why is it? You can link it back to instance. Maybe you can see that there was a change made recently in relation to it. And so you start to get a much better picture of what's going on for each and every one of your critical services. Now, I've used the word service a lot here, and that's because service is the context. It is very typical and traditional to have a focus on what I call horizontal capabilities, this belief that if we manage through processes and tools, we'll get the right outcome. And that was very much in line with the thinking of, ITIL version 1 and ITIL version 2. The idea was the secret sauce of service management lay in the management of technology or the management of processes. As we get closer to the modern world, the thinking that we put forward in service strategy and remains today in ITIL 4 is actually the secret sauce of the management of services is around understanding what those services are and the value that they bring. And so this two-dimensional view that we are increasingly seeing absolutely resonates with, maybe you call it the DevOps community or the product orientation. But again, it's talking about the same thing. It's essentially saying the real value is in these verticals. And sometimes this sort of whole thinking is called verticalization. And we're not saying that the horizontals are not important, but we're saying it's the services that give context to the things that we might want to do in the horizontals. And that's becoming increasingly important because the idea that one size fits all in a portfolio where you've got some systems which change very infrequently, maybe payroll, for example, it's a non-differentiated service for many organizations, right through to the other end of the spectrum where maybe it's a very dynamic system which needs to change very regularly. You need to be able to have horizontal capabilities that work for both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. And that's where we see the emergence of what we're calling patterns. These different archetypes of services maybe have slightly different ways of applying the concepts of the horizontals, but maybe in a way which is contextualized by the services. Now, just to give you a good example, most people are familiar with incident management. Traditional incident management is something might happen and, ticket will get created, somebody will go and fix it, et cetera, et cetera. In modern management of services, it could be a very different disposition for incident management. Through much better observability and through automation and maybe through blue-green deployments or feature flags, when an incident is spotted, and instead of actually having an incident and creating a ticket and getting somebody to work on it, maybe the response is to automatically unroll the feature flag or repoint your customer base back to the previous green deployment, for example, And it's a very different style of managing incidents to what we traditionally expect. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just to recognize that there are so many different tools and techniques and levers we can pull to do things that in many ways we need to try and understand how we embrace those ideas in the pursuit of providing good services. Now, would you invest in a blue-green deployment for payroll? Would you invest in feature flags, loosely coupled architectures? For many people, the answer would be no. And that's not to say it's not an important service, but does the investment really warrant that style of service versus something which maybe is business differentiating and making changes to it very rapidly will give you some market competitive advantage? So we've talked a lot about services, and there's a key principle in the world of service management, which is excellent services need excellent owners. And again, whether you take the term services or products, that's largely irrelevant to this discussion. The key principle is these product/service owners are becoming the most important roles in a technology organization. It's these roles and these people that face off to the business on a day-to-day level. They have to help make critical governance decisions about the future of the service, what needs to change. They have to talk about new features and functionality. They have to understand what the customers feel about using the service. They have budget responsibility for the service. They now even maybe have sustainability responsibility for the management of their service. And I call those sort of looking up or looking out things. They're things which you've got to really understand the external context in order to be able to make sensible choices. But then on the other hand, these product and service owners need to be able to be more introverted, look inwards or look downwards, however you want to phrase it. It's this idea that they need to be able to work with their teams to deliver on these commitments. So they need to know about the architecture. They need to know about how they're going to do major incident management. They need to know, and maybe they need to practice regular failure scenarios. Maybe they want to leverage analytics in order to really try and predict patterns within the service and things that might happen to it in future. So these roles are critically important. It's not obviously just the service owner, because the service owner is backed up by a whole service team, and that is very much in keeping with Atlassian's themes around powering teams to be successful. But it is absolutely fair to say that there is a democratization of power in the technology organization where it's not really the CIO and his or her 20 direct reports where the real power lies. That power is now shifting more and more and more rapidly to this large portfolio of product and service owners who have to make day-to-day decisions on the management of their products and services. Now, the next key concept that we've seen sort of appear time and time again comes back a bit to organization. We call this a service agility spectrum. And the agility spectrum is quite an interesting idea because it has to recognize that some systems need to be managed in a way of a full stack team. Everyone's part of the same team. Decisions need to be made very rapidly. There's a sense of common goals and objectives. And also the way that you source for that organization structure may be different from maybe on the other end of the spectrum where the system is less dynamic. Maybe the boundaries between applications and infrastructure are okay because of the economies of scale, how you manage those types of systems becomes more useful. And again, it's not saying that either's right or wrong. It's to recognize that the way that you approach management at one end of the spectrum can often be slightly different from the way that you apply management and teaming on the other end of the spectrum. Now, where do you start with this kind of approach? As I said earlier, we have a service portfolio. It could contain, I'm with a client at the moment where they've got 1,800 different applications in their environment. So it's easy to consider that they've probably got somewhere in the order of 1,000 of these technology-based services that really power different business units. And so trying to bite off all of those in one go is clearly not reasonable. So we take an agile approach to what we call service engineering. And the broad principle being, divide your portfolio into a smaller subset, identify where you can make some real meaningful improvements, mobilize your service owner, baseline your service against, or your services against, those elements of 360-degree service value. And then we do something called a service health check, or service engineering health check, where we inspect all of the components of the service to really make sure that we understand what are the levers that we could pull in order to improve elements of 360-degree service value. And then, as with all agile approaches, we then put that into a backlog, we decide what we're going to do, and we get on and do it. And once you've done that, then remeasure against those elements of 360-degree service value in order to know whether you have made meaningful improvements or not. And then the act of, rinse and repeat, agile sprint 2, 3, 4, etc., allows you to decide what you want to do next. And also, once you've done that and you've started to learn, you have the ability to then scale out to the other parts of your service portfolio. And again, by finding areas where you've made real meaningful difference will give you the momentum and impetus to go and make real meaningful improvements for other parts of your portfolio. So in closing, the last thing is the service engineering checklist is actually a really vital tool in order to make this happen. And the difference between a checklist and a process is, in a process, you tend to be very prescriptive. You must follow these steps in this logical sequence with the hope and anticipation that if you follow the right steps in the right order, you'll get the right outcome. Now, in a checklist type world, sometimes we refer to it as minimum guardrails. It's much more descriptive rather than prescriptive. And so just as an example, instead of saying to a service team, you must follow the test management process, there's a looser descriptive question, which is, do you have the right degree of automated testing for the release cadence of your service? Meaning, if your service needs to change very regularly, you will need more test automation. It's very difficult to make releases on a very rapid basis if you don't have test automation. But the question is, how rapid do you need to be? And therefore, how much test automation do you need? What's the depth of test automation you need? What's the scale of test automation you need? And so it's more trying to ask a provocative question about how do you know whether you've got enough of these? And that also comes back to some of the principles of lean, which is, you're trying to find areas where you're doing just enough in the context of what the service needs, rather than trying to seek perfection and never getting there and trying to constrain everyone by adhering to the same process. So those are some of the critical principles of service engineering, some of the things that we've seen time and time again across the industry. I hope that you've taken away some interesting ideas here. But aside from the sort of the theoretical side of things, it's actually much more important to hear about how does this really happen through a real story. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to walk us through some real life examples of how we've brought some of these concepts to life. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Damian. So let's dive into it. So as Damian talked about, we're seeing a shift in how organisations look at monitoring and observability of their technology and the services they provide to provide a much greater alignment to the business outcomes and customer experience. So to start, defining what your organisation's services are is critical. And we can see in this flow how to approach it. So we understand who our personas are, who are the users of the service, who are the critical stakeholders in the service, internally and externally. We decompose the service into its piece parts and then overlay that on the technology that enables it. Subsequent to understanding that technology landscape, defining what good or success looks like is key. And that shouldn't be limited to technical metrics, but importantly, how you measure business outcomes, such as revenue, and customer experience, such as performance or time to deliver an order. You will then be able to identify the data that you need to connect those dots and then define the user interface to provide a clear view of the services and its performance. To bring this to life, it requires a selection of tools across your technology landscape. Most organisations have one or more of these. However, it's important to agree within your team what tool will do what job in this list to enable your teams to properly align on the data, align on the metrics, and then collaborate and action when needed. And lastly, choosing your flow will be dependent upon which tools are in which place in your strategy. You can see here that flow 1 is shorter, but doesn't create the same level of consolidated service visibility, but can create the foundation for flow 2 and 3, a bit more sophisticated in terms of how they drive a consolidated view into a service platform through to the service response. How do you manage incidents and into the action and automation? So let's bring this to life, as Damian said. So in this example, we have Dynatrace and Splunk being leveraged as the core monitoring tool, with that data then being sent to Splunk to create a service view. We then have integrations with Atlassian Jira Service Management and the service response components, previously part of Opsgenie, and status page for communicating with stakeholders. And then the action via our collaboration tools to then close the loop with a problem ticket for root cause investigation in our Jira backlog and understanding the broader impacts of that capacity utilisation in Jira Align, really critical for our product owners and our service owners. Let's double click into what this can look like for you and your team. We're using status page here to provide customers and external stakeholders on the status of key services. In service engineering, this clarity and transparency has two key benefits. One, it builds trust in your services. And secondly, it reduces inflow of tickets by keeping customers or users informed. And behind the scenes in our service visibility platform, we can see that it's a calm day in the galaxy. Our store service here is defined in such a way that we can see the experience of customers across different transactions, across different planet locations, all very service orientated. But things do go wrong. And on this day, our application performance tool picks up a spike in the number of requests for the store, which then feeds into our service visibility platform. And we can see here that our checkout service is now red for our customers across all planets due to an impact to their customer experience. And this is a key part of the service engineering. That extra load or higher CPU or memory utilization isn't an end in itself, but rather the service outcome that's being measured. And because we don't want to rely upon having dedicated eyes on glass to identify when our service turns red, we use the standard integrations to create an incident into Jira Service Management. In our experience, integrating with the service management tool best leverages the workflows available to engage the team responsible for the service, rather than simply firing alerts from within the service visibility platform. So here we know we now have a ticket created in Jira Service Management. In this integration, we have a clear mapping to the service impacts, which will enable subsequent automations and actions. This begins with engaging the team automatically that supports a service, utilising what we call the service response components in our flow diagram here in Jira Service Management. We talked earlier about defining the metrics and the thresholds when defining your service, and Damian clearly articulated those in terms of that difference across different types of services. This is key for when defining which incidents will become a backlog and a queue versus those which will trigger the service response workflow to engage the on-call team. Because it's slow performance of a critical customer service, in this case, we engage the on-call team immediately. Using the service mapping integration between Jira Service Management and status page, we also automatically update the service status for customers and users. Hence, the team can focus on service restoration rather than the first comms out that a service is impacted. Highlighting how service engineering is complementary to DevOps ways of working and CI/CD capabilities, as Damian talked about. Mapping services to development pipelines can accelerate the triage of issues by correlating deployments and changes with incidents. This could be done in the service visibility platform, but again, in aligning with your team on what tool will do which job. Here, we've undertaken it through integrating the service management platform, Jira Service Management, with Bitbucket in this case. So because we have some indicators of what has caused the service experience to suffer, we can engage the broader team on next steps. This type of approach has been quite targeted in terms of who's engaged, and it's enabled by the structure of service engineering and an investment in understanding the technologies and the processes that underpin the service. An incident-focused approach would see teams from across the organisation immediately pulled into an issue rather than a methodical engagement driven by data and insights, which are then powered by the workflow. This clear workflow enables clear updates out to stakeholders, customers, product owners, service owners. A major incident management team can all see clearly the updates flowing and the teams being engaged. The action then continues through collaboration within the team and across teams. Not everything will be magically automated, and hence integrating with the collaboration tool not only solves for the immediate service response, but also provides a record of actions for post-incident reviews and problem management, seeing the steps, undertaking retrospectives on how the team could collaborate better or work faster. So the code is rolled back and the team here can resolve the issue all in a single place. And that all flows through to the incident record and also to status page to update customers and users. Because service engineering drives that culture of continuous improvement beyond simply resolving the incident, we're also integrated with Jira to place the story and the engineering backlog to investigate root cause. The workflow is supported through automatically creating that story because the incident was raised as critical. And finally, because the story will consume team capacity for the current program increment, this will be visible at a portfolio level in Jira Align, raising any dependency issues as a result. So the service owners and product owners get that visibility up at a portfolio level as well. That's quite a few apps stitched together in that flow. But as we dive into the lessons learned, you can clearly see that service engineering is as much about workflow, about people, teams, and culture as it is about technology. But you can start incrementally with agility to begin extracting that value. You do, however, as a team, need to be prepared to commit, to define the service, to align on the tools, on how your workflow will come to life. So just start, not be deterred by the potential scale, but how you can see value from just starting with one service. So to get started, align your team. Everybody needs to be on service engineering in your team. Agree your tools and platforms as we talked about. This creates the alignment of the data, of the metrics, of the thresholds, and also creates reuse and broader value when you start connecting into other services. Define your services. Start with the most critical or the most visible, first to align to customer and business value. Choose your workflow, how your tool sets integrate together and support your workflow. Based on your metrics as your data begins to flow, and then iterate, as Damian said. Build the culture of continuous improvement, collaboration, and agility that is core to service engineering. Thank you very much for joining Damian and I today. All the best with your service engineering journey.